Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the National Humanities Center Humanities in Class webinar series. Tonight's session is titled Baptism of Early Virginia. And I'm pleased to be joined by Dr. Rebecca Getz of New York University on today, March 4th. My name is Andy Mink. I am the Vice President of Education Programs at the Center. I want to thank you for joining us after what I'm sure is a long Thursday at work, whether you're virtual or face-to-face. On behalf of my team, Libby and Mike, as well as our graduate student interns, Hannah and Carly and Josh, we're very aware of the hard work that you're doing this year. Honestly, I've always felt that this was probably the hardest time of the academic year anyway, but add on top of it all the other disruptions and tragedies and things that are going on. It's really pretty remarkable that you're doing so much good work for students. In particular, I want to welcome back Lee. Lee's joining us from Eastern North Carolina. I want to say hey to Krista, who's at Palisades Charter Elementary School, our old friend Teresa, who seems to be here virtually every webinar. Thanks for joining us, Teresa, from Iowa. And Amy is here from Leander Independent School District. It's nice to see a wide variety of folks in our audience from geographies and grade levels and interests. And we're hopeful tonight that everything that we share will be applicable and useful for your teaching. The National Humanities Center is entering really the last half of the fellowship year. We continue to be working in a blended environment where about 2/3 of our fellows are coming to the center on a daily basis and the other third are working remotely. Our staff is kind of on a skeleton crew, working both remotely and occasionally being in the building. But what we're aiming to do really is continue to support scholars like Rebecca Getz, who's with us tonight, in the good work they do. And I often try to think of ways to describe what that work might be, and hopefully we'll make it visible tonight. But I do remember very distinctly Becky being with us several years ago, and right at the end, or probably right in the beginning, right in the middle of Governor Ralph Northam in Virginia putting his foot in his mouth, and I don't mean that in a flip way, I mean that in a kind way, around using the term indentured servitude as he referred to the enslaved of the early 17th century. Becky getting in the car and driving to Richmond to set folks straight and giving a public talk at VCU, Virginia Commonwealth University. And I think ultimately that's what many of our fellows do in addition to their research and their time away, is they continue to work to connect community and educators and the general public with the straight story, with helping us understand the complicated nuance and the context of what's happening around us. And I think tonight we'll in some ways extend that conversation. I do hope that you spend some time in the Humanities in Class digital library. Of course, all of you have a library card now. You signed up for the webinar through this system. But I hope you also go to it and search for and curate some resources that might be helpful for you. Those resources certainly will include materials and instructional support resources that we've developed at the center. But as I often say and want to point out, this also includes resources from many other organizations across disciplines, including New American History. Annie, thanks for being with us tonight. Including also work created by and published by the educators who use the system. And I do encourage you or your department or your faculties to use this as an OER platform, not just to get materials, although being able to do so in a trustworthy and free way is, I think, a real value added, but also to develop instruction based on the resources of both the center and our partners. I encourage you to look through that, find the materials that make sense for you. We'll be dropping some links in the chat box tonight that might help you start that process. I also hope that you join the webinar series group in the digital library. This is where we put not only the pre-readings for each session, also support instruction that our TA researches and finds. We also put the recordings of the webinar once it's completed. So that's where we'll put the full 75 to 90-minute webinar. We've also been working more recently to segment these recordings into 10 or 12-minute topical segments that you can use with your students. While this platform is teacher-facing, I have a lot of teachers around the country who also encourage their classes and their students to get a library card. If you do that, it's very easy to then assign as a prompt or a formative assessment or a piece of homework or part of a project you might be doing, resources that you'll find in the library. I should also point out that we do create exhibits and collections as well. And one that might be relevant based on your interest in tonight's session is the collection titled Teaching About Race, Place, and Social Justice. So again, take advantage of all those materials at your leisure. We are in the back end of our webinar series this year. We've got, I think, 12 left before we conclude in early May. Many of you likely teach social studies or history or have some interdisciplinary interest in that. I do want to point out some upcoming sessions that you might find valuable and interesting. If you haven't signed up, you might consider any one of these as a way to not only improve your understanding of the subject, but a way to rejoin this community and continue to share with your colleagues. And more directly, if you're really interested in the history of Africa and the relationship between Africa and the New World, America, United States, you might be interested in going back even further to medieval Africa and Africans. This is one of our most successful and popular online courses. It does launch for our spring session on Monday, although you've got a couple of days still to register and participate. We would love to have you join if this is a topic of interest. As always, I want to recognize and thank our Teacher Advisory Council. Scattered across the country and just as busy as everyone, they have been invaluable contributors to our work at the center in our education department. That does include being TAs for our sessions. Jennifer Jolly is with us tonight from Melbourne, Florida, and she's going to be dropping links and questions and generally being irreverent in the chat box. And I do appreciate her participation as well as all the contributions of our council. Finally, just as a reminder, while many of you are veterans of these webinars, I do want to walk through one more time the best way to engage with us. And that starts with making sure that you can view and hear what we're sharing. Right at the very top of your screen, there's several tabs. One of them says slides on it. If at any point tonight you can't see the slides and you can hear us talking, it's likely that that tab isn't selected, and it's easy just to move back to it. You're not going to disrupt this. You're not going to impact anybody else's viewing by moving in and out of those tabs, so I'd encourage you to do so. You can also adjust your audio using the audio volume button, which is just beneath the photograph of the speaker. Right now it's my photograph, and make sure that you can hear well. If for some reason you can't hear well or your Wi-Fi is acting up, it's very easy to either refresh your screen or just simply log out and come back in. It will not disrupt your attendance in the session. And then finally, we really do encourage you to use the chat box as much as you like. This is a place to chatter and talk and ask questions, share URLs and resources. If you've got a specific formal question, though, that you'd like me as the moderator to bring to our speaker, then please use the Ask Professor Getz button, and I'll find the appropriate time to interject myself and bring those questions to the forefront. So again, thank you for joining tonight. The Humanities in Class webinar series session is titled Baptism of Early Virginia. I'm super pleased to see again, at least in a virtual sense, Dr. Rebecca Getz from New York University, also a past NHC fellow in the years 2018-19. Again, we are joined by Jennifer Jolly, who is our TA tonight. She's also a high school teacher in Melbourne, Florida. So Becky, thanks so much for joining us. You are up in New York right now. Can you hear me?
I can.
Fantastic. I can hear you as well. I want to thank you for joining. This is a complicated topic, and I've got a couple of questions I'd like to bring forward before I turn over the PowerPoint to you and invite you to move forward. I don't remember, by the way, if you remember vividly that sense in February of 2019 when you were driving, Interstate 81, trying to set people straight in the Commonwealth. As a matter of fact, I went back to your Twitter feed and I noticed that you tweeted on. By the way, this is what happens, right? You put things on Twitter and people bring it up to you later. You tweeted, "Every time I think I'm done with Virginia history, I get dragged back in." Do you remember saying that?
I do, actually, Andy. And at that time, that was the tweet thread that I wrote that had the most retweets. I think it ended up getting close to 1,000 retweets, which is a lot for me. But I was very, very frustrated with Ralph Northam's remarks because they were just historically wrong. Yeah. And there are very few times when a historian can say, absolutely, no, that's wrong. You've got it wrong. But this was one of those times.
Well, I appreciate not only the directness of it, but as a native Virginian, I appreciate that you went up to offer your expertise and your authority. But really, that leads to, I think, what for me is going to be the opening question. Again, as someone who grew up on the East Coast, who lives on the East Coast, who grew up literally an hour from Jamestown, I get it. This is, if I were to see this title on the screen, I would immediately go, wow, that's important to me. But we've got a lot of folks from all over the country. Tell us why the story of early Virginia is really a story that everyone, no matter where you live, is important to them. It's not a Virginia story. It's a story that all of us should consider. Why is this more than just Virginia?
I think the way that I like to answer questions like this is to say that questions of race and how race comes to be as a category that organizes society and how it comes down to us in our present, those are universal questions. And what Virginia is for me is a laboratory. It's a space where I can ask those questions of the documents that we have from 17th century Virginia, and I can then construct a historical narrative that begins to explain what was race, what is race, and how did we get to be here. Yeah. And so even if you're not from Virginia, even if you've never been to Virginia, that is still a question that you are living in your daily life. How did we come to be here? Why did the George Floyd protests happen in the way they did? Why did Confederate monuments become targets? Why are we having the conversations about race and nation that we are having now? So even if you're not from Virginia, and even if you will never go to Virginia, those questions are animating our politics and our lives right now. And so I think we can use the explanatory power of the Virginia experience.
I think that's a really answer. I'm getting a little bit of feedback, by the way, Becky. It could be that. Can you hear the feedback?
Yes.
Okay. It could be that you've got maybe if you can mute your computer. I think what we're doing is hearing your laptop back through your microphone.
Okay, if I mute my computer, then I can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, because I had to unmute the computer.
Okay. Hopefully, whatever just happened, hopefully we can troubleshoot that on the fly. But my point, though, and sort of my final point, and I'm going to turn this over to you, is that it's such an elegant answer, and I think for everybody in our audience, for you to give us the really clear tiles to lay down between early 17th century Virginia and George Floyd is a remarkable superpower. And that's ultimately what our teachers are aiming to do as well for younger students. So thank you for joining us, and we're anxious to hear how that connection is made.
Thank you so much, Andy, and thank you for inviting me to come and do this. I've done talks and exercises like this with teachers in Texas, where I used to live, and also here in New York City on a regular basis. And I know that teachers struggle with how to present these issues in the classroom on a regular basis. And so I hope I can give you today something to hang on to and a way of approaching these questions in the classroom. So I'll start with a very kind of basic setup. In 2019, the New York Times debuted what it called the 1619 Project, coordinated by the journalist Nicole Hannah-Jones. It involved artists, poets, writers, historians, all contemplating the meaning of the year 1619, 402 years ago now, right? 2019 being the 400th anniversary. And so what the project was trying to do was make connections between that 17th century past and the 21st century present. And it chose the year 1619 for two reasons. The first reason is that that was the first year that Virginia held a legislative assembly. So for some Americans, 1619 is the year in which representative democracy was born in the space that we now call the United States. For others, it is also the foundation of slavery in English-speaking North America. This was the year that John Rolfe, writing a letter, reported that a Dutch privateer visited and sold what is known as the 20 and odd enslaved Africans. And so for the 1619 project, this was the most important aspect of 1619. This was the foundations of slavery, of racism, and of American inequality. So I really like thinking about origins narratives. Where do we start our stories about ourselves? How do we start those stories? And why do we tell them in the way that we do? And what the 1619 project was trying to do was get us to stop thinking about 1619 and representative democracy and get us to start thinking about 1619 and slavery and race in the space that becomes the United States. What do I mean when I say race? This is a difficult kind of question. We want to have, I think, a rigid definition of what it is, that it is an immutable and ahistorical biological category, but it isn't. It's an adaptable category. It has meant different things to different people at different times in different places. In the 17th century, the word race meant kinship or common descent. It implied a sense of heredity and lineage, but it also signaled cultural and ethnic differences, including religious difference. So it was a malleable word, and when we use it to describe the 17th century, it doesn't necessarily mean the same thing as it means in the early 21st. So what I want to think about today is how did Anglo-Virginians understand what they were doing? How did they understand slavery? How did they understand race? And more specifically, how did Anglo-Virginians come to understand Black and Christian to be irreconcilable terms? And this was the question that really animated me as I was writing this book. And I came to this through a guy by the name of Morgan Godwin, who was an ordained minister in the Church of England. Sorry, can you hear me, Andy?
Yeah, I can. Professor, do you mind saying that line just one more time for emphasis? The two terms that are that cannot be resolved. Say that line one more time.
Sure. It's how did Anglo-Virginians come to understand Black and Christian to be irreconcilable terms?
Right. Thank you.
And this comes directly from Morgan Godwin, whom you see on your screen here. I don't have a picture of him, unfortunately, but he was kind of a pain in the butt, I have to say. He was an ordained minister in the Church of England, and I think that he ended up rubbing people the wrong way in England, and so got sent to the colonies, which was basically purgatory for a minister at that point. But he was in Virginia between 1666 and 1671, and then was driven out with what he called hard words and evil language, and eventually had to go to Barbados. He didn't make it in Barbados either, and ended up going back to England, where in 1681 he wrote this pamphlet. It's not really a pamphlet, actually. It's over 100 pages long, and it's a very angry pamphlet for good reason. But it was called The Negroes and Indians Advocate, Suing for Their Admission into the Church. And I have reproduced it here for you with all of the what we would consider to be spelling and grammatical errors. But in it, he wrote, these two words, Negro and slave, being by custom grown homogeneous and convertible, meaning they could mean the same thing. Even as Negro and Christian, Englishmen and heathen are by the like corrupt custom and partiality made opposites, thereby, as it were, implying that the one could not be Christian, nor the other infidels. And I was really taken by this quote, because what he's basically observing is that planters in Virginia by the mid-1660s assumed that enslaved Africans could not become Christian. And he flips it on its head too, and he says that they also assumed that white Englishmen could not behave like infidels. And so that he's observing, I think, something that's happening in the culture of Virginia. Now, I don't want you to think that Morgan Godwin is some kind of hero, because he's not really. He was not anti-slavery. He did not believe that enslaved Africans were the equals of Anglo-Virginians, but he did believe that enslaved Black people could and should be converted to Christianity. And his planter neighbors in Virginia clearly did not think that enslaved people could become Christian. So what accounts for this difference? So to understand why the English-trained Godwin and the Anglo-Virginian planters were so different, we've got to go a little bit further back to the beginnings of English colonialism in Virginia. And so just take a moment to look at this image. It is of a man that you will probably know as Powhatan, but Powhatan was more like his title. So that was kind of his political title. His personal and given name was Wahunsonacock. And this image was made in 1607 or 1608 and then circulated in England afterwards. In 1607, when the English showed up in what they called Virginia and what Native people called Senecamoca, there were about 30,000 people living in about 40 village-centered communities scattered throughout the York Peninsula of what is now Virginia. If a Native person were to look at this image, they would see a very powerful person, right? We've got Powhatan here in the center. These are probably women who are his wives on either side, and he's seated above his community, right? So for Native people looking at this, this was an image of power. From an English perspective, though, they were looking at this and thinking of the Native people as primitive in a lot of respects. But the important thing to think about 1607 is that Wahunsonacock certainly perceived the English arrival as an invasion of sorts. But what he could not see was that within 25 years, his people would suffer grave depopulation from this English invasion, and that colonialism would become fully entrenched. So I like thinking about this image as an image that was full of possibility. And there were a number of different directions that history could have taken at this moment, but didn't, obviously. Now, the English had a wide variety of views of their colonial practice, but the most important thing that English thought about themselves was that they were better than the Spanish. And I'm going to just pop up an image here, and I'll toggle back to this slide. But I just want you guys to look at this for a moment, and you can say in the chat what you're seeing, or you can kind of think about what this makes you feel, and then I'll explain what this image is in just a moment. But take a moment and have a look at it.
Yeah, Professor, let's take a moment and let folks type their responses into the chat. What do you see? How does it make you feel? What can you infer? What questions do you have? Be sure to look at not just the primary area of the image, but maybe the implicit and explicit meanings. Thank you, Suzanne.
Is this the Inquisition? No, not yet. Although this is kind of I think this would be difficult for, say, a junior high school audience, but I think high school students could look at this. Slaughter, lynching, torture. Yeah. Inhumane, disturbing, violent. Yeah, all of these things, right? You have this image here of a man dashing a baby against a boulder, and this other picture of human beings being roasted alive. So this is So this is the kind of image, and somebody has just said that this is the Black legend. Yes, this is exactly what this is. This is how the English viewed Spanish colonialism in the Caribbean. And this particular image is taken from a 1583 version of the Dominican friar Bartolomé de las Casas's Brevísima Relación de la Destrucción de las Indias, translated into English as the Spanish colony. And it started to circulate in England in the 1550s. This was still being circulated, this image, and various versions of the Spanish colony were still circulating in the 1680s and 1690s. So we're looking at over a century of these kinds of images. And this is how the English were thinking about Spanish colonialism, and they thought that they were going to be better at it, right? That they were not going to do the kinds of things that the Spanish had allegedly done in the Caribbean. I know that was a difficult image to look at, so if you need to take a moment to kind of process it. But I want you to kind of understand the visual world in which the English were living, right? Even if you couldn't read, you could look at an image like that and be like, nope, we're going to be better than the Spanish. The Spanish are evil, but we're better. So it definitely comes out of the Catholic and Protestant divide. The English thought that Protestantism would be better for colonialism. They thought that the way that they were going to approach Native people was by first emphasizing the universality of Christianity, that everybody could become Christian, and that included Native people who were also potential Christians. And all they needed was humble teachers and good examples, and then they would convert to Protestantism. What the English were thinking of was basically forming an Anglo-Indian Commonwealth in Virginia. And this is how they were theorizing it prior to 1607, right? They're writing about how this Anglo-Indian Commonwealth is going to come about, and it's going to be a model and a beacon, and it's going to be everything that the Spanish were not. The Indians would not be equal partners in this Commonwealth. They would be junior partners. But this is the kind of optimism that the English were bringing to this project, right? They really saw Native people as potential Christians. In any sermons that were being delivered for the Virginia Company, they're always quoting the book of Acts, chapter 17, verse 26. And God hath made of one blood all nations of men for to dwell on all the face of the earth. And the one blood part of this is really important, right? And so the English are looking at this and they're saying, well, the Spanish repudiated that notion of one blood, but we're going to bring it back, and we're going to do this properly. But were the Spanish actually worse? Because the vision that the English had is not how things turned out. And basically by 1609, the Virginia colony is mired in endemic warfare with the Native people, with the Powhatans. In 1609, Captain James Ratcliffe, just as an aside, this probably wasn't his name, and he was also likely a Catholic spy. That is some information that has recently come to light, and I just find this fascinating, but it's not particularly germane. But you can ask me about it later if you're interested. Anyways, James Ratcliffe was raiding a Nansemond village because the English didn't have anything to eat, and so he was basically there to steal their corn. And the Nansemonds were not having any of it. They were like, nope, we're not doing that. And they captured Radcliffe and later ritually executed him by scraping his flesh, quote, from his bones with mussel shells, and before his face, throwing the little gobbets of flesh into the fire. And his English friends were kind of across the river listening to him scream while he died. In revenge, James Percy, who was the younger brother of the Earl of Northumberland, kidnapped the Werowonskwa, the female political leader of the Paspahis. So not the Nansemonds, right? The English didn't understand that these were different communities. And he captured her and her children, and they were in a boat heading back to Jamestown, and he threw the children overboard and then shot their brains out in the water. The men he was with also wanted to execute the Werowonskoa by burning her to death, as had happened to Ratcliffe. But he said that he preferred a swifter dispatch and later put her to the sword, meaning he stabbed her to death with his sword and left her body for the Paspahis to find. So if we're thinking about the English wanting to have a kind of different relationship with Native people, things went south very, very quickly. But this warfare did not destroy the idea of a potential Christianity for Native people, or that Native people could be converted to Christianity. This is from a sermon by William Symonds, which was delivered in London in 1612 for the benefit of the Virginia Company, so to raise money. And you can see, as he says here, Christ our Savior hath, according to his infinite wisdom, revived the old law of filling the earth in a most excellent manner. Go teach, saith he, all nations, and baptize them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. A little bit of an echo of Acts 17:26 there, right? So you can see the kind of persistence of a theology of conversion. I'm going to put this picture up, and I'd love for you guys to have a look at it. Some of you may recognize it.
And we'll pause for a moment, let folks get their fingers ready to type in their responses. Tell us what they see in this image. Professor, while folks are responding to this image, can you give us just a couple of bullet points in terms of the primary goals or missions of the English as they came to Virginia? In other words, you mentioned a moment ago, this notion of finding the Indians, being able to convert them. Conversion perhaps is one. What were some other reasons why they were here?
Well, they thought they would find gold.
Yeah.
They assumed that the New World was just full of gold. Virginia doesn't have any gold, but they did not know it at that moment. There was also kind of idle talk of using Virginia as a base to raid the Spanish treasure fleets. That was not something that James I approved of. He had made peace with Spain after he took the throne in 1603. But nevertheless, the English had, kind of a piratical nature about this. And they thought, well, if we can't mine the gold, we'll steal the gold. Right. And so it was also kind of bound up in this race with Catholic Spain in order to be able to be better colonizers.
Thank you. And as you can tell, there's just a moment or so where our audience gets their answers responded and before we see them. But you can start to see some of those coming in now. Yeah.
Yeah. I really would like to hear from Patricia about having that is really fascinating that you grew up with this painting. Anne is commenting on the lighting. So what this is, of course, is the marriage of Metahuaca, or Pocahontas, as we know her, and John Rolfe in April of 1614. The painting is by John Gadsby Chapman. It was done in 1839, and it was hung in the rotunda of the U.S. Capitol in 1840, and there it is to this day. In fact, watching coverage of January 6th, I could be like, oh, there it is in the background. Yeah. But you see how the light is centering her right here in the front. And then off to the side, there's a little bit of light on these four Native people who are here. But it's got this kind of Roman look to it with the columns and the flowing clothing. So it's all about this kind of civilizing process.
Do you mind boring down into that a little bit? You just noted that it was visible in the Capitol. Why is it there? And this is just commentary, right? Why do you think this is such a well-regarded, preserved, commemorative image?
When we're talking about origins narratives, right? Yeah. 1619 is one origin narrative. For hundreds of years, the baptism and marriage of Metahuaca to John Rolfe, is also an origins narrative. And it's an origins narrative that emphasizes peaceful contact, the destiny of white Englishmen in the New World, the kind of progress from savagism to civility that's kind of embodied by the native people here who are in a state of, they're not clothed in a European fashion, right? They don't look civilized, but here is Metahuaca kneeling before the patriarchal power of the white minister with her flowing clothing, looking civilized, right? So this is an American mythology represented here, and I think that's why it's in the Capitol.
It's so amazing that Genesis story, accurate or not, fake news or not, mythology or not, is still so visible and still such an important part of the story we tell ourselves.
The Lower York Daughters of the American Revolution chapter is called the Pocahontas chapter. And so, she's been kind of absorbed into a narrative of national beginnings. But what gets covered up, I think, is that we know her as Pocahontas. That was a nickname she had as a child. Her name as an adult was Metahuaca. And she was kidnapped by the English when she was on a diplomatic mission for her father, Wahunsonacock, to the Rappahannocks along the Rappahannock River. And she was there to do trade negotiations. She was a diplomat. At that time, she was married to one of her father's counselors, a man named Coquitlam. And it's likely that she had already had a child. And this is a kind of background story that we don't necessarily hear when we talk about her, right? That's why I think it was so powerful to look at that cartoon image at the very beginning. And that is the Pocahontas that most of our students think of also. So when she agreed to marry John Rolfe, I think she was really continuing her father's diplomatic mission. But Rolfe was uneasy about this marriage. And he wrote to Thomas Dale, who's the minister you see there, that he was uneasy because of the, quote, heavy displeasure which Almighty God conceived against the sons of Levi in Israel from marrying strange wives. And by strange wives, he meant foreign wives, right? Wives that were not Christian. And then Rolfe said he was also uneasy because, quote, her education hath been rude, her manners barbarous, her generation cursed. And by generation, he means her children would be cursed, right? Cursed by not being Christians. And then in this letter, this is such a remarkable letter, Rolfe goes on to say that that he would be like the biblical Daniel, and that he would, quote, bring many to the true knowledge of God. Namely, they shall shine like the stars forever and ever, which is a quote from the book of Daniel. And so Rolfe is really seeing the marriage as a way of making Native people Christian, of bringing Native people into this Anglo-Indian commonwealth that they were thinking of. I think that Metahuaca was seeing it as a way of bringing the English further into her father's orbit and perhaps bringing them under Native control. So I don't think they went into this understanding that they didn't understand this on the same terms. But both groups, Native people and the English, went into this marriage with a great deal of hope. And the marriage was imbued with a lot of promise for the English and for Native people, but Metahuaca died in London in 1617, probably of pneumonia. And one of the things that she had done was she taught English people how to plant tobacco. And after her death, English people kept seizing Native land for tobacco, insisting on conversion for those who didn't necessarily want it. Native people were already in less than ideal circumstances. When the English arrived in Virginia, they were in the middle of a decade-long drought. So there was already a lot of stress on this society, and having more than 1,000 people, additional people, pour in and start seizing the land with a very thirsty crop, tobacco, was a problem. After Wahunsonacock's death in 1618, his brother Opechancanough took over. And in 1622, he had had enough of the English. and led an assault against the English and a variety of English settlements. This is a picture that circulated in later in 1622 in London. If you want, you can just take a moment to kind of look at this. I'm sorry, I hadn't really thought through the fact that I was showing you a lot of very violent images. I apologize for that.
That's okay, because I think what we're able to do in this context is, with your guidance and with your facilitation, be able to really make sense of them. It's not that our audience will share this directly with their students necessarily, but it really does sort of position the way that you're making this argument in really clear terms. And as Ginger says, Ginger from Fort Collins, Colorado, the images are great.
I'm glad that they're good for you. I think you could use them with a high school audience. I think that would probably be okay. Somebody had mentioned Thomas Harriot a little bit further back in the chat. I can't see it right now. But you'll note that the native people depicted here are taken from Thomas Harriot's drawings. And so they're basically repurposing of those images. But there's this one over here to the left by the table, a native man killing an English woman. This is an image that was meant to inflame, right? If we're thinking about the image I showed you earlier of the Spanish colony, that was also intended to inflame. This is how English people learned about the world. Most of them could not read, but they could look at a woodcut illustration that was circulating of something like this and understand this in a very particular kind of way. So the so-called assault of 1622, sometimes known as the uprisings of 1622, the massacre of 1622, changes everything. And the Virginia Company member Edward Waterhouse wrote in 1622, the houses were generally set open to the savages, who were always friendly entertained at the tables of the English, and commonly lodged in their bedchambers. And their familiarity with the natives opened a fair gate for their conversion to Christianity. But after the massacre, everything changes. And he starts to say, the Indians who were before used as friends may now most justly be compelled to servitude and drudgery, and some may be sent for the service of the summer islands, meaning that they could enslave native people and send them to Bermuda to work in tobacco fields there. So a kind of really serious change in attitude there. Richard Johnson, who was an alderman of London and a shareholder in the Virginia Company, wrote in 1622, as for converting of the infidels, it was an attempt impossible, they being descended from the cursed race of Ham. And I just want to say a little bit about what this means. For those of you who are familiar with the book of Genesis, so this is chapter 9, verses 18 through 29. This is after the ark has found some dry land and they've planted some grapes, and the grapes have flowered and they've made wine. And Noah drank it and got drunk. And his son Ham made fun of him for being drunk and kind of passed out. And when Noah awoke and learned that Ham had made fun of him, he cursed Ham and said that Ham's descendants were destined to serve the descendants of his other sons, Shem and Japheth. And so the way that English people were thinking about this in the 17th century is that Africans were probably descended from Ham, and so therefore were only fit for servitude or slavery. And so what you're seeing here, I think, is the abandonment of this idea of potential Christianity. And they're beginning to think in terms of a heathenism that was hereditary both for Native people and for Africans. So 1622, I think what I'm saying is a turning point. It's a moment at which everything begins to change. And Godwin later talks about this, right? I mean, he says, the planters say that Ham, together with his whole family and race, was cursed by his father. And so he talks about this going forward. And it becomes an organizing principle for the way that Anglo-Virginians are seeing the world. I can pause there if anybody has some questions or things that they are curious about and want me to talk a little bit more.
Yeah, there are some questions that are popping up, and I'd like to bring them forward if it's all right. I want to start though. I'm going to go back and I'm going to change. Let's see, we're on slide 28. I'm going to go back, Professor, and I'm going to ask for one clarification. Mm-hmm. Our good friend Lee Holder, who is out in Eastern North Carolina, messaged me and asked either for some clarification or perhaps this is a correction. Is this a photograph of the marriage or the baptism of Metacoa?
I think this actually might be the baptism because that is a font that is there.
Yeah, I think you might be right. So just to be clear, I think even though we've got the caption as marriage, I think this is the baptism. Yes?
Yes, but this is the male figure here and the English male figure here in the front is Rolf.
Got it. Yes, absolutely. Thank you. So I'm going to go back to our slide 28. So talk to us a little bit about your process of the work you do as an historian. You've put forward and shared documents, images, paintings, verse. How do you put all this together? If you can just kind of step out of it in sort of a meta self-conscious way, how do you do this work to stitch these things together to create this kind of thesis?
Well, it takes a lot of years. I worked on this for a decade, no joke. I worked on this for a decade. And I realized that by the middle of the 17th century, we don't really have sermons anymore as sources. What we have are laws, right? And court records and court cases and lawsuits and these kinds of things. And so I thought I've traced it up to the 1620s, 1630s, and gotten to this point where 1622 is the turning point. Where do I go from there? And so it involved a different set of sources to take the story forward. And it involved learning how to read 17th century handwriting. And Virginia court hand looks like chicken scratch. It's just terrible. And really trying to contend with what does it mean to have a law in place? Are people passing the laws because they want that to be the standard of behavior, or are they encoding a standard of behavior that already exists? And that's kind of an unanswerable question, but you kind of go round and round with it. Why did some people sue over these issues? And so those are the kinds of questions that I was starting to ask next. But my method as a historian is basically that I go into the archives and I vacuum everything up and I bring it home, and then I start taping it to my walls and trying to figure out how it all fits together.
I think that metaphor, that image is actually really powerful. History itself is gone. It's never coming back. On the other hand, the more pieces you add to that that sort of taped wall mosaic, the more pieces you can add, the more complete the facsimile might be, right? So you're working with a lot of documents, and I've never heard the term, but I really appreciate the term court hand. So it seems like you must have had to really learn how to read these documents in a very literal way.
I should have actually put one in the PowerPoint just so people could see what it looks like. It's not fun. But I would just say, Andy, I don't know if you knew this, but when I was at the NHC, those giant Post-it boards that you have, the kind of wall-sized ones, they kept disappearing, and that's because I was stealing them and papering the walls of my office at the NHC with my notes and my timelines and my genealogical charts.
Yeah, I don't want to get too inside baseball here, but we looked for those in the education department many times and had no idea where they were. But thank you for finally fessing up.
Sorry.
Last question before we move on.
Sure.
With several sort of up in the chat, and as you've already noted, kind of scrolls out of view. So I'm pretty sure this was Alan, and I believe Alan is in Colorado, just outside of Denver. Alan noted that this could be really difficult for parents or students to start to comprehend. In your own experience as a teacher, as an educator, as a speaker, as an historian, as a writer, what seems to be where is the friction? What seems to give people the most difficulty in accepting these, what seems to be very clear evidentiary-based steps that you're laying out?
Whenever you're talking about the Bible, you're going to get people getting upset. Regardless of whether or not you think they should be upset, they will get upset. Although I think there are ways of talking about this without having to use the Bible as a part of the source material. But any time that you're talking about slavery, any time that you're talking about race, any time that you are connecting those things to Christianity, people can get touchy. And so the way that I generally do it is that I start for my students, and I'm talking freshmen in college, so they're 18. So they're at the old end for you and at the young end for me. I kind of break it down for them, and we start by just talking about the differences between Protestants and Catholics. Now, when I taught in Texas, everybody knew the difference between Protestant and Catholics. In New York, nobody knows the difference between Protestants and Catholics. And so we take it from there and we build on that. But I think that showing people the actual documents is really, really helpful. And I've got some good ones that are coming up. I'm happy to talk more about this. Sometimes when I give this presentation, I get folks who come up to me and they're like, you hate white people and you hate Christians. And I'm like, well, I'm a white person who is also a Roman Catholic, so I don't hate myself. I don't know what to say. This is history. This is the past. I can't change it. I can only tell you that this is a reasonable interpretation of how it was. Right. In a public school, you might want to leave the Bible parts out.
Right, and again, that's sort of stitching together the evidence that you discover, and the more evidence, the more documents, the more complete the story can be. Thank you for making that visible. I think sometimes as educators, we often think about and talk about, either mimicking or modeling the process of being an historian, but it's a complicated business, and we appreciate you giving us some insights.
And I will say I am protected in a way that those of you who are public school educators are not, right? I am a tenured professor at a private university, and that gives me protections that many of you don't have. And so I understand that you need to lightly. I think some of the documents I'm going to show you coming up are going to be usable in that sense. In fact, Andy, I wrote some curricular material for Joe Schmidt. I can ask him if I can give that to you. I will.
It'd be fantastic. Yes, thank you.
So I want to talk about what happens after the 1620s and 1630s. And the changes start to come in the 1620s, right? We're talking about an increased reliance on slave labor rather than the labor of English indentured servants. We have court cases over issues of race and slavery starting in the 1630s. And then in the 1660s, a series of laws regarding illegitimate children, baptism, the treatment of servants and slaves, and eventually in 1691, laws about marriage. In 1691, interracial marriage was prohibited in Virginia. That law and various versions of it remain on the books until Loving versus Virginia in 1967. And so what happens in the 1660s is consequential. Right? It is going to be a roadmap for the next 300 years. And so baptism is one of those issues that a lot of court cases coalesce around. And for the English, baptism was a ritual of inclusion in the Christian community, right? It had to do with salvation. You can't be saved if you haven't been baptized. But there's a more secular meaning to it too in English society, and that is baptism had a connection to freedom and other rights and privileges of Englishmen. And so in Virginia, you find enslaved people who were being asked to testify, for example, they would have to say, oh yes, I've been baptized. And for the English, that would then say, well, that means they understand the difference between right and wrong. So baptism has this connection to freedom and to rights and to privileges. And an enslaved man by the name of John Gwawir absolutely understands this. And in 1641, after the birth of his child, he went to court and he said he desired the child should be made a Christian and be taught and exercised in the Church of England, by reason whereof he did for his said child purchase its freedom. And the court then noted that the child shall be free and remain at the disposing and education of the said Gwawir and the child's godfather, who undertaketh to see it brought up in the Christian religion aforesaid. And this is, I think, a really remarkable document in a lot of ways. John Gwawir remained enslaved, but somehow he gathered the funds to purchase his child's freedom, but he also understood that in order to make that freedom real, he needed to make his child a part of a Christian community and have people recognize that. So the child is baptized. The child has a godfather who can look after it. I don't know if it was a male child or a female child. It's common in 17th century England to use it as a pronoun. I know that's probably jarring for you, but it's quite normal in that case. In another case, a young woman named Elizabeth Key, who was the mixed race daughter of an English planter and an enslaved African woman, sued for her freedom in 1654. Her father had died, and her father's widower had decided to enslave Elizabeth Key. So she got a lawyer and she sued. And the biggest piece of evidence that she produced for her freedom was that she had been baptized and that she was a practicing Christian. Elizabeth Key won her case and then married the lawyer who brought it for her. So here we have these two examples, right, about 13 years apart, of enslaved people using baptism as a route to freedom and having that be recognized in the courts. Well, planters did not want that anymore. So I want you to take a moment and have a look at this document. And I think this is one that you can play with in class and get students to look at. Jennifer, I'm really appreciating the links that you're popping in the chat. That's really great. Ruth has asked a big question here. To what extent was this decision economic? That's really a really tough question. Obviously, planters are, well, maybe not even obviously, planters are absolutely motivated by economic gain. They want to have the cheapest labor possible in order to grow the most tobacco possible. But they can't just say we want to make money, right? They have to have a whole apparatus to justify what they are doing in Virginia, and that's where the story gets significantly more complicated.
As an historian, do you find yourself essentially researching justification?
Sometimes, yes. This is so complicated, right? Because part of what I'm doing is trying to figure out exactly what happened and who it was happening to. And then I have to try to figure out why it was happening. And the why of why it was happening is not always the same as how people were justifying it, if that makes sense.
I would probably suggest that it's usually not the case, right? We're constantly sort of readjusting ourselves to make that fit. Yeah,
I think that's absolutely right. At any rate, this law was passed in 1667, whereas some doubts have risen whether children that are slaves by birth and by the charity and piety of their owners. I love the way they put this, right? It's disgusting in so many ways. made partakers of the blessed sacrament of baptism, should by virtue of their baptism made free. It is enacted and declared by this great assembly that the conferring of baptism does not alter the condition of the person as to his bondage or freedom. And so basically what this law is saying is, it's great if you baptize enslaved children, but that's not going to make them free. So the mechanism that John Gwalior used to secure his child's future and that Elizabeth Key used to escape slavery, no longer open to enslaved people after 1667. This might have happened in direct response to a guy by the name of Fernando, who was an enslaved man belonging to Captain John Warner, who in 1667 sued for his freedom, and in support of his freedom, he produced, quote, documents in Portugal or some such language, so possibly documents written in Spanish or Portuguese. And so there is some speculation that this baptism law in 1667 comes directly from Fernando's bid for freedom. There's also some speculation that Morgan Godwin was involved in passing this law, because what he wanted to do was encourage planters to baptize enslaved people, but he didn't necessarily think that planters should then have to give enslaved people their freedom. And one of the reasons I think there's probably a connection between our old friend Morgan Godwin and this law is that he writes about this later. Remember, he was in Virginia between 1666 and 1671, so directly when this law was being passed. And in his pamphlet, he relates a number of conversations that he had with planters. And he said that one planter told him that might as well baptize a puppy as a certain young Negro, right? So you can see the beginning of associating enslaved Africans with animals. And that's happening here. Another planter, this one a woman, said that baptism was to one of those enslaved people no more beneficial than to her black bitch, right? So to her dog. So you see the real kind of animalistic, bestial language being applied to enslaved people here. And another planter told Morgan Godwin that because they are black, they are therefore Ham's seed, and for under this curse, and therefore no longer men, but a kind of brutes. So here we have, I think, the complete repudiation of the idea in that earlier English people had, coming from Acts 17:26, that all people on the earth were of one blood and had been created at the same time. What Morgan Godwin was seeing was a real commitment to the inequality of enslaved people. And that upset him. And I think that he might have used some of that anger to try to pass this law, thinking that it would benefit enslaved people in a way that it didn't. Now, I don't want to leave you with the impression that enslaved people just took this lying down, because they did not. By the early 18th century, there were many enslaved Black Christians in Virginia, and they were beginning to assert themselves. And in 1728, an enslaved woman named Mary Aggie, who lived in Williamsburg, Virginia, sued for her freedom based on her baptism. So, right, just completely ignoring that the baptism law of 1667 exists. I love this. And she went before Lieutenant Governor William Gooch in 1728 and said that she wanted to be free. And Gooch was really conflicted about this in a lot of ways. She was able to say her catechism. She could say the Lord's Prayer. She said that she wanted to be able to read the Bible. And Gooch was actually disposed to free her. And the House of Burgesses, the Legislative Assembly of Virginia, would not let him. They were like, nope, not happening. And a couple of years later, in 1731, she was accused of stealing sheets from a slaveholder named Anne Sullivan. And instead of executing her, as would have been the punishment, Gooch said, well, she's a Christian, she should be able to have benefit of clergy, which by the early 18th century simply meant that she'd be branded on her thumb and then transported out of the colony. She was probably sent to Barbados, where she would not have lived very long. But nevertheless, I think in Mary Aggie, what you see are enslaved Black Christians beginning to push back against this Anglo-Virginian idea that they were unequal. You see this also very clearly in 1727, about the same time that Mary Aggie pursued her lawsuit. And in that year, a group of enslaved men somehow managed to put a letter together. And if you see this letter, it's in the archives of the Bishop of London at Lambeth Palace in London. And it's clearly on homemade paper, and it's written with homemade ink. The ink is very faded, it's kind of reddish. And they're writing to the Bishop of London, and they say to the bishop, release us out of this cruel bondage. And they say our taskmasters, meaning the slaveholders, are as hard with us as the Egyptians was with the children of Israel. I think this is the first time in American letters that you see enslaved people referencing the book of Exodus in this way and referring to themselves as the children of Israel. It becomes quite common in the 19th century, but in the 18th century, I think this is the first time we actually see that written out by enslaved people themselves, saying this is what we think. They did say, we dare not subscribe any man's name to this, meaning they wouldn't sign the letter, for fear of our masters, for if they knew we have sent home to your honor, meaning the Bishop of London, we should go near to swing upon the gallows tree. So they feared that they would be persecuted if it was found out that they were asking for their freedom from the Bishop of London. There's no record of a response from the bishop, and the letter itself was misfiled with the Jamaica papers. And so it wasn't until the 1990s, another historian was pawing around in the Jamaica letters and was like, this is clearly from Virginia. They say they're from Virginia when they sent this. But I think this is extraordinarily powerful, right? These enslaved people understood the structure of the Church of England. They understood that the Bishop of London was the bishop who served the colonies, but they also thought that their Christianity should guarantee their freedom, release us out of this cruel bondage. It's really remarkable. Andy, I'm seeing that there's a question here.
Yeah, there is. Thank you for noticing that. This question comes from Suzanne. Suzanne is curious, and she'd like some clarification and for you to talk a little bit about what the connection is between the descendants of Ham and Blacks. Is there evidence that Ham migrated to Africa?
I mean, the English were really confused about a lot of this, and they didn't have our modern understanding of where humans came from. And so there was a lot of back chatter among the English that some would say, well, Indians are the descendants of Ham, but how did they get to the New World? Nobody could quite figure that one out. There was the other part that was the descendants of Ham had gone into Africa. But some theologians didn't think that that was right either. And they said that there was no evidence that the children of Ham had gone anywhere in particular. The Spanish definitely didn't subscribe to this. They said very clearly, starting in the late 16th century, that Native Americans had crossed via a land bridge in the Northern Pacific. And that was something that they were saying by the late 16th century. There's also side debates that are happening where Asians, the children, the descendants of Shem, Ham, or Japheth. And then there were folks in North America, including Francis Lejeune, who was a Huguenot minister in North Carolina, who was convinced that Native people were Semitic, that they were the descendants of Shem. So there's a lot of confusion about this, and I wouldn't say that there's necessarily a unified perspective from the English. But they are very obsessed with trying to recreate these genealogies that involve the children of Noah and trying to figure out where everybody had come from. Did that answer the question?
I think so. You got pretty close, and I appreciate you taking a moment to clarify that for Suzanne. We have about 20 minutes left. I know you've got just a few slides left. I have a couple of questions queued up, but I'm going to ask you to go ahead and, well, you know what? Let's pause for a moment because this is what Ulysses does in all of our webinars. He comes in with a question right at the end. He'd like to know if symbolically Ham was cursed by Noah, so it could be used that there was an excuse to keep Black folks, he says, folks under slavery. What's the connection there?
Yes, absolutely. And this is most well developed by the 19th century, where you see pro-slavery activists in the United States South making this connection direct and explicit. Great.
Why don't you go ahead and conclude with your final remarks, and then we'll bring all the questions in the last 10 minutes or so.
Sure. So in terms of resistance, we also see, this is a quote from Lemuel Haynes. Lemuel Haynes was a Methodist minister in New England in the 1770s. He eventually, after the Revolutionary War, was the pastor for a primarily white congregation in Vermont. But starting in 1774, he was very much kind of involved in this language of liberty. And here it is, Acts 17:26, making an appearance again, right? It says, "It hath pleased God to make of one blood all nations of men for to dwell upon the face of the earth. Therefore, we may reasonably conclude that liberty is equally as precious to a Black man as it is to a white one, and bondage equally as intolerable to the one as it is to the other." So here you have a free Black man, a minister in the North, using the language of unity, of common descent, and the language of liberty that's coming out of the American Revolution to make a similar case to what the early English in 1607 were saying, right? It's kind of a return to this set of theological ideas. I love Lemuel Haynes. I think that he's absolutely somebody that you can use in class as a way of talking through these issues. Lemuel Haynes was not alone. A lot of enslaved people saw the British as the best arbiters of freedom. And if we think about the American Revolution as a slave rebellion, which I think we can, we have about 20,000 enslaved people who, over the course of the war, escaped behind British lines. Some of these people were part of Virginia Governor Dunmore's Ethiopian regiment, and they fought for the British. And others were active in Baptist communities in Virginia and the Carolinas and fighting after 1778. So Black people were really taking this as an opportunity to seize their freedom. This leads, I think, in the 1780s to a pro-slavery resurgence in Virginia. And pro-slavery activists began to use the Bible very explicitly, using this quote from Leviticus, for example, and also talking about the curse of Ham in very direct kinds of ways in order to connect Blackness and freedom, and unfreedom, rather. So if we're thinking about how successful these challenges were, I think it's an important thing to think about Black Christianity as a site of resistance. And it's a site of resistance starting in the 1640s, and that continues all the way up to the 1770s. But we can look into the early 19th century and see Black Christianity continuing to be a form of resistance. So in Gabriel's rebellion in 1800, Gabriel likened himself to Daniel and actually used the same verse that John Rolfe had used when he was considering marrying Metawaka, comparing himself to Daniel in the lion's den, for example. In 1830, Nat Turner, who led a rebellion in Southampton, Virginia, was also a Baptist preacher. And so I think it's really important to understand that Christianity was deeply complicit in making race, but Christianity was also critical to resisting race. So if we come back to the kind of fundamental question that I was asking at the beginning, why did racial categories and racism emerge? How did they emerge? They come out of this welter of ideas about human difference, about common descent, about how the English were going to be better than the Spanish and then turned out to not be better than the Spanish. And then it's been codified in law in order to benefit English slaveholders. But I would also say that race is not a predictable outcome of colonialism. It had to be constructed, it had to be reconstructed. Slaveholders had to constantly fight to keep these ideologies in place. And enslaved and free Black Christians were constantly using Christianity to fight against these particular ideas. And so I like concluding with a quote from James Baldwin. He said, "History is not the past, it is the present. We carry our history with us. We are our history." And so that, I think, is an important takeaway. Things that were happening in 1607, 1614, 1619, 1641, 1654, 1667, right? Those are all of our past, but it's also our present. And it's actually an important part of what shapes our present. And I struggle in my own classroom how to get that across to college students. I know it's not easy. But I think one of the ways of doing that is not being shy about saying that there's a connection between 1619 and 2019, that there's a connection between Black resistance in the 18th century and Black resistance in the George Floyd protests. And that's how I often put it to my students. But we can continue to talk about that. I know that there's questions popping up. That is me finishing up, Andy.
And I was searching frantically for the mute button to unmute myself. Thank you so much for those insights. I'm going to invite our audience to start to add some questions to both the Ask Professor Getz box as well as the audience chat box. And while they're doing that, I've got a couple of what may seem like technical questions, but I think it helps fill in the blanks of the entire scope. This question is from Tisha. Tisha is joining us from Connecticut, and she asks, in her words, aren't some enslaved people in Virginia able to petition for their freedom on the basis of their participation in the Revolutionary War?
Yes. And so some enslaved people who fought on the side of the Americans did petition for their freedom after the war. Some of them got it, some of them did not. And for some, we don't know what the outcome was. There's one that I use in class. It's a great document. I can dig it out and send it to you. But the students have an interesting time parsing it. He was sent to work by a slaveholder who was a patriot in a lead mine, and he spent the war in a lead mine. But one of the details of their description of him is that he only had one foot. And so I talked to students about why did he only have one foot? It was fairly common if you had an enslaved person who was a chronic runaway to maim them in some way to make it impossible for them to leave. And removal of the toes or removal of the foot was one way of doing that. So even in those documents where enslaved people are petitioning for their freedom, the documents themselves contain the evidence of the violence of slavery in really profound kinds of ways.
Thank you. In that spirit of filling in some of the gaps between then and now, Jennifer Jolly, our TA tonight, asks the question, how is the 17th century thinking of what's defined both Englishmen and Anglicism shape religious intolerance or tolerance in the 18th century? So just from 17th to 18th century, how does that, what is the connection there that you've seen?
It's kind of hard to say. I think we have a tendency to think about the 18th century as a time of religious toleration because of the Enlightenment, and you've got Voltaire running around, and everything is looking different. But I think on the ground in Virginia or even in New England, expressions of Christianity don't necessarily embrace that form of toleration. In Virginia, they were very suspicious of Methodists and Presbyterians, for example, and it was a real fight in the 1780s to disestablish the
Right.
church in Virginia. And so I'm not sure actually that I see a real radical break between the 17th and 18th century, or even a little tiny break. I think there's actually a lot more continuity there than there is break. Voltaire notwithstanding.
Here's the next question. I'm sure you're very, very familiar with the controversy around the 1619 project.
Yes.
Tell us your thoughts. Tell us your thoughts, not just about the value or the quality or the need for the project itself, but of the controversy itself. What's going on with that 1619 project?
I found it very surprising, Andy, because I read it in one sitting. I was just fascinated by it. And it wasn't that I agreed with every single argument that it made. I just thought it was such a creative presentation of the evidence and such a creative set of engagements with historians, with artists, and others. I thought it was fantastic. And that doesn't mean that I didn't want to critique it. I was like, well, why 1619 and not 1519? 1519 being when the first enslaved Africans were brought to the island of Hispaniola in the Caribbean, right? So the transatlantic slave trade basically starts more than a century earlier. And I had these moments where I was like, can't we destabilize the nation state and not make the United States the center of everything? But that notwithstanding, I thought it was a great project. But what I think it has done is that it has hit a nerve. And I think that many Americans are deeply uncomfortable talking about this past. And they don't want to have a conversation in which we say, look, race and slavery mattered then, and it still matters now. It doesn't necessarily matter that slavery has been over since 1865. The ideas and the attitudes that underpinned it continue into the present, and they're deeply damaging. And the 1619 Project does that, right? Actually, one of my favorite parts of it has nothing to do with Nicole Hannah-Jones's opening essay. It's where Kevin Cruz is talking about building federal highways and the interstate system and how that basically cut Black neighborhoods in two. I see it here in New York in the Bronx, right, where the Cross Bronx Expressway just basically obliterated an entire neighborhood. He writes about Atlanta, or talking about loans and mortgages and redlining, right? So it's about the continuities between 1619 up to the early 21st century. And I think that is what makes people uncomfortable. And it doesn't matter how much evidence there is. It doesn't matter how many historians can come on and say, oh yeah, this is, I've seen this in the archive, I can write about this. It's making people uncomfortable.
So let me flip that question a little bit then. I asked you initially how your comments on the 1619 Project, and largely from a general public perspective, how has the Academy received this? How has your colleagues in the AHA or in the history world's networks that you inhabit, how are historians responding to that 1619 Project and its controversy?
Well, my Latin Americanist colleagues are annoyed because it ignores Spanish-speaking parts of what becomes the United States. They're like, what about Florida? What about California? I think that critique is absolutely right. Then you also have the historians who are angry that they weren't asked to be involved in it. And I think that's the source of Gordon Wood's opposition to the 1619 Project. Gordon Wood is now in his 80s. He was a professor at Brown for many years, and he wrote a very famous and very useful book called The Radicalism of the American Revolution. It came out in 1992. And so much of his critique was, how could they not come to me to ask me about this? And so I think those are two flanks of it. But I think in general, historians, we're always thinking about how to communicate with the general public. We write our monographs and we write them basically for ourselves. My book sold 800 copies, and that was kind of a minor miracle. And so it's not like it's widely read or anything like that. But here is the 1619 Project, representing our scholarship for a wider audience, for classroom use with, attached curricula. And I think in general, most historians are pretty enthusiastic about that, no matter how they might quibble with how the date was chosen or this or that small aspect of it.
And then the third piece of that question is, you travel, you speak. I mentioned at the introduction that you went to Richmond several years ago and you spoke in the midst of, the, if not scandal, at least the controversial conversation around Governor Northam. When you're talking to a general audience, not historians, not educators, but just the general public, how do they respond to what you're sharing?
Well, that particular example in Richmond, I couldn't leave for an hour afterwards. People kept coming up to me and saying, "Thank you so much for saying this." It was more likely to be people of color who were saying that, but it's generally pretty well received. I was later invited. There was an Episcopal minister who ministers to a church in Richmond who had come to that talk and asked me to participate in a phone call with some of her parishioners because they were starting to struggle with the history of the Episcopal Church and slavery, and they were wondering how to cope with this, and they thought that I might be able to help and just kind of wanted to talk through some of these issues with me. So in general, the reception is pretty good. I think it helps that I have this kind of two-pronged aspect to the argument that Christianity is deeply complicit in making race, but also critical to resisting race. So for most people, that means that I'm not pigeonholing Christianity or Christians, that I'm sharing that there's a kind of set of complex interactions there. But like I said, sometimes people are very insulted, and there's just not much I can do about that.
Thank you. I've got one last question for you. We have just a couple of minutes before we conclude. Hey, Professor, where can we get your book? This is your hint for the next slide.
Next slide. You can actually get it on Amazon if you are able to order from Amazon, or if you feel like it's okay to order from Amazon. But you can also get it directly from the Johns Hopkins University Press, and it is less than $30 and affordable in paperback. So you can get the whole book. You read what's basically a chapter of it for today, but the book kind of rehearses the whole arc with all the evidence that you could possibly want, that you can then kind of repackage for classroom use if you want.
I'm going to put words in your mouth and say that if you included your email there, that's not an idle threat. In fact, you are inviting any kind of follow-up if our audience has questions.
That's fine. I don't mind at all. Although I will say that I have another talk to give tomorrow that I have not written yet. And so I don't know how I get myself into these situations. So if you email me tomorrow, and you may not hear until early next week, because I'm going to be pedal to the metal for most of the day tomorrow.
Fair enough. Becky Guest, thank you so much for sharing your insights tonight on the baptism of early Virginia. We really do appreciate you spending the evening with us.
Thank you all for being here and listening. I know that this is such a difficult time, and I'm sure that most of you just would prefer to rest and, fetch up on the couch with a cat and a glass of wine and maybe some chocolate and kind of recover from the day. So I really appreciate that you were willing to spend an hour and a half with me.
I also want to thank all of you for joining us tonight for tonight's webinar. I would encourage you to follow the National Humanities Center on our social media feeds, both Facebook and Twitter, to get advance notice of upcoming information and opportunities. Don't forget to go back to that Humanities in Class digital library to not only get resources that we've shared tonight, but also a recording of tonight's session that you can share with your colleagues and your classes. Our next webinar is scheduled for March the 11th, next week. I'll be joined by Sandra Bickham Washington, who is an assistant professor of American literature at Florida Atlantic University. And Dr. Washington is going to be working with us on how to expand the canon. That is to say, to find and to really talk about other contributions of contemporary African-American women authors in Southern literature, ways to expand the canon of what we teach in our English curriculum. Please do share this with your colleagues and your faculty. We've got plenty of room for your entire network. We hope to see you again at our next Humanities in Class webinar. Thank you, everybody. Have a great day at school tomorrow. Weekend's almost here. We'll see you next week. Thanks, Jen.
Take care and stay safe and healthy, everyone. Andy, are you still there?
I am, and so is the audience. So we're going to mute ourselves, and I'll text you.
Oh, I was just going to say that I can hear passing by my house on Broadway a huge Black Lives Matter protest.
That's fantastic.
You might hear the echo of it, but yeah, I just wanted to say that I feel it right now.
Thank you for saying that. And this is what we call the director's cut of the webinar, because again, the audience can hear us talking. So this is like them hearing us after the cameras have sort of pretended to leave us. But I'll text you on the side.
Okay.